They say Greystone Asylum had always been on the edge of memory, a sprawling institution perched atop a hill, where the wind cut like blades and the fog pooled in the hollows below. No road led directly to it, only a narrow carriage path winding between skeletal trees, lined with iron gates that creaked without wind. By the time anyone cared to take note, the asylum was already half forgotten, abandoned long before its horrors were officially acknowledged. The first account of Greystone that survives comes from a physician's report, dusty and folded, discovered in a forgotten archive decades later. Dr. Edwin Harlow, a man of meticulous notes and hesitant handwriting, recorded that the asylum opened in the spring of 1900, built for patients deemed incurable by other hospitals. It stood isolated, away from town, ostensibly for privacy, but residents whispered that the hill itself seemed to want it there, its presence sanctioned by something older than human law. By 1904, nearly 100 souls resided within its walls, patients, nurses, and a few physicians. None stayed long enough for the public to remember them. Admissions and departures were always quietly noted, records sealed under official ink, signed and countersigned, yet the faces inside remained obscured. Staff recalled strange occurrences almost immediately. Doors would slam without cause. The faint echo of footsteps filled corridors long after the hallways had emptied, and the air carried whispers that could not be traced to any speaker. One of the most persistent witnesses was Nurse Margaret Clive, a woman in her late 20s, with a sharp, angular face and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her expression taut. She described mornings when she entered wards and heard patients murmuring under the blankets, voices soft but urgent. At first, she assumed delirium, sleep-talking, or fever dreams, but the content of their words was coherent, sometimes confessional, often impossible. "They speak of things they could not have known," she wrote in a notebook later recovered from the ruins. "Names of people long dead, places unseen, secrets no one could have told them. It chills the marrow." The asylum's architecture was an echo of Gothic severity. High windows barred with iron cast long shadows across narrow hallways. The walls were thick, lined with cold plaster that seemed to absorb sound. In winter, the wind would howl through the chimneys in broken panes, rattling loose timbers, yet inside there was a muffled stillness, as though the building itself breathed in tandem with its inhabitants. Dr. Harlow recorded that patients began behaving peculiarly in the autumn of 1904. It began subtly. A man named Samuel Brine, confined for mania, would hum low, repetitive tunes while staring at the wall. His nurse noted that the hums sometimes carried fragments of conversation from rooms he had not yet entered, almost as if the air itself remembered voices. By November, more patients were speaking of the people under the floor, claiming they had secrets to share. Some asked the staff to listen quietly, whispering their names, as though announcing them aloud would break a fragile covenant. By mid-December, the phenomenon had escalated. Nurse Clive described a night when the entire West Wing was still, the patients silent, as though holding their breath. Then the whispers returned, not from lips, but from the walls themselves. She wrote that the voices seemed to emanate from the floorboards, rising through the soles of her boots, a vibration faint but insistent. The patients, when asked, only nodded knowingly. "There is no one there," she recorded, "yet they speak to me as if we have shared years together, and I hear their words even after death." Some of the asylum staff claimed that the patients' words grew prophetic. One young man, confined for catatonia, would murmur names of people who would die in distant towns. Another patient, a woman restrained in the padded ward, described events unfolding in London with exacting detail, as if recounting newspapers before they were printed. At first, The physicians dismissed these as coincidences, exaggerations, or the fevered fantasies of the ill, but the consistency, the accuracy, and the sheer number of such accounts became impossible to ignore. Late December brought the first vanishings. Dr. Harlow recorded that a patient named Tobias Crane, known for his mutterings, simply disappeared from his cell. Doors were locked, windows secured, yet when staff returned, he was gone. Nothing remained, no footprints, no sign of struggle, not even a whisper out of place. A week later, another patient disappeared in the same manner. Panic began to ripple through the asylum staff, yet the patients who remained seemed neither surprised nor frightened. They simply hummed their low, knowing tunes, as though expecting it. Margaret Clive wrote, "I have seen them look down at the floor listening. I have heard them call names I do not recognize. Yet they do not cry, they do not resist. They wait." The cold of early January deepened. The staff reported that doors began refusing to open on their own. Drawers jammed, instruments fell without touch, and the lights flickered as though the air itself were dense with anticipation. Patients spent hours kneeling by the walls, whispering, their hands tracing patterns along the floorboards. Some claimed to hear the deceased speak back. Others drew figures in ash and chalk, maps of corridors and rooms that did not exist in the architectural plans. One particularly unsettling account came from Dr. Harlow himself, who noted that during rounds he heard his own name spoken clearly, though he was alone in the hallway. He felt a faint, insistent pressure at his feet, like a hand beneath the floorboards. He bent down, listening, and swore he could hear his own footsteps mirrored softly beneath him, as if the earth were repeating them with careful precision. By mid-January, the asylum had taken on a new and dreadful rhythm. Staff arrivals and departures were haphazard. Some refused to enter the building at all after sunset. Patients continued to whisper, now seemingly speaking across invisible channels, recounting confessions, secrets, and names that none could verify. No one slept easily. When lights were extinguished, the walls pulsed with faint movement. A careful observer could sometimes hear soft knocks, thumps, or murmurs that seemed to reply to one's own breath. On January 23rd, a nurse recorded a singular event that would be referenced in every later report. She had remained in the East Wing after midnight, tending to a patient who insisted she listen to a tale of a child who never aged. The floorboards beneath them shifted subtly, rising and falling like the swell of water. She wrote that Tobias Crane, who had vanished weeks prior, appeared in her vision, not physically, but in the space between perception and memory. He raised a finger, as if counting, then vanished entirely. She fainted from the intensity of the experience, and when she awoke, the ward was empty of all patients. The building itself seemed alive. Dr. Harlow noted in his last surviving entry that the asylum no longer obeyed simple laws of physics. Doors resisted opening, hallways stretched slightly longer than before, staircases felt uneven. Snow fell outside but never accumulated at the entrances. Even the morning light behaved strangely. It illuminated corridors briefly, then retreated as if the building itself rejected illumination. As winter progressed, the remaining staff grew increasingly terrified. Nurses refused to enter rooms alone. Footsteps echoed when no one walked. Shadows moved against logic. The whispers grew more coherent, no longer fragmented mutterings but full phrases, sometimes entire confessions that had never been spoken aloud in life. Margaret Clive described lying awake in the darkened staff quarters, hearing patients debate matters with each other, though they had been long gone. By February, fewer than half of the asylum's original staff remained. Records became erratic. Dr. Harlow wrote of his final efforts to document the events, noting that even ink on paper seemed to resist permanence. Words blurred, letters disappeared from sentences, names of the vanished faded into smudges. He concluded his notes with a sentence that would later haunt archivists. The building listens, and it remembers. Those who leave do not depart entirely, they whisper still, and we answer even in absence. By early March, Greystone stood silent, yet not empty. The remaining staff had abandoned hope of conventional understanding. They described the building as listening, not merely observing. Corridors stretched further in the shadows, and every door seemed to sigh in response to human presence. Even the air within had grown weighty, dense with expectation. Margaret Clive, now one of the few who remained, wrote in her journal that the walls themselves seemed to breathe. She claimed she could feel the exhalation and inhalation of the structure through her fingertips pressed to plaster. It is patient, she noted, and it waits for the proper moment, for the proper acknowledgement. The patients, those who were neither alive in the conventional sense nor fully absent, communicated in ways impossible to categorize. Whispered confessions emerged from every surface: floorboards, ceilings, the cracks where plaster met stone. The voices were coherent, sometimes pleading, sometimes instructive. Margaret and the few remaining nurses learned to listen carefully. One evening, Dr. Harlow and Margaret descended into the east wing with lanterns. A strange draft carried the faint odor of antiseptic, as though the asylum itself were reenacting the memory of treatments long past. The walls pulsed subtly, like the soft rise and fall of a chest. Tobias Crane, the boy who had vanished in January, appeared again, not physically, but as a shadow between perception and memory. He raised a finger in that same counting gesture Margaret had seen before. "They are arranging themselves," she whispered, voice trembling. "They are ordering the space, and we are not part of it." That night, the final vanishings occurred. Margaret recounted that the floorboards beneath the east wing shifted in slow, deliberate waves. Lanterns flickered and went out. When light returned, the remaining patients were gone. Dr. Harlow, his hair disheveled and eyes wide, wrote his final entry as if dictating to the walls themselves. "The building has taken them, not destroyed, not broken, but absorbed, and we are next to join the whispers." The staff who survived the night fled the asylum at dawn, leaving behind all records, instruments, and personal effects. Those who attempted to return later found the building altered. Doorways appeared where none had been, hallways led into dead ends, and windows looked out onto vistas that should not exist according to any known topography. Decades later, in 1932, a team of archivists discovered Margaret Clive's journals and Dr. Harlow's fragmented notes in a storage room of the town's municipal building. The papers were brittle and faint, yet legible. Her final entries were chillingly calm, devoid of fear. She wrote of understanding, of realizing that the asylum was not a prison for the living nor a sanctuary for the sick, but a vessel for memory itself, a repository of voices that persisted beyond death. "The counting is complete," she wrote. "They do not leave. We cannot resist. We are threads in their weaving. Listen, and you may hear what we were never meant to forget." Historical investigators who later examined the Greystone site reported peculiar anomalies. The hilltop remained unnaturally quiet. No bird sang, no wind disturbed the trees. Soil tested decades later showed compaction far beyond natural levels. Subsurface scans indicated voids beneath the building's footprint, chambers aligned with eerie precision, yet unaccounted for in architectural plans. Some local legends grew around the asylum. Children who dared to peek through the rusted iron gates claimed to hear whispers in the wind, counting in soft, meticulous tones. Shepherds in the nearby hills swore that fog rolling up from the valley carried fragments of conversation, a chorus of voices that spoke of names, confessions, and secrets long forgotten. By 1951, one historian noted that every account of Greystone contained consistent anomalies: the whispers, the vanishings, the counting, the building itself behaving like a sentient organism. No evidence suggested malice. The phenomenon was patient, deliberate, and meticulous. Yet all who interacted with the site left changed. Some suffered nervous breakdowns. Others spoke rarely, haunted by the echoes of voices they could not place. Modern researchers attempting to map the site encountered inexplicable interference. Compasses spun erratically. Electronic devices failed without reason. One field engineer, lowered into a shallow excavation, reported feeling walls that did not resemble Earth. The surfaces were smooth, slightly warm, and faintly yielding. Grooves, evenly spaced and worn as though by constant pressure, lined every chamber. When the engineer attempted to ascend, his rope vibrated violently, as if responding to some consciousness below. Reports were suppressed. Maps were redrawn. The hilltop became effectively erased from public record. Yet whispers persisted, carried in oral traditions, half-remembered letters, and the rare, carefully guarded diary. Margaret Clive's final passages, written with trembling precision, described a profound revelation. She believed the asylum had never been meant to contain the living. Instead, it preserved essence, the thoughts, confessions, and unspoken fears of its inhabitants. Death did not sever connection, it amplified it. Each patient, each staff member who entered Greystone became part of an ongoing chorus, contributing to an eternal memory. "They are patient," she wrote, "and they do not count in haste. Every voice is noted, every confession heard. The building does not judge, but it remembers, and I can hear them still, guiding me, ordering the unseen corridors, teaching me to listen." By the late 20th century, all structures of Greystone had collapsed. The hilltop lay overgrown, abandoned, and yet witnesses continued to describe faint sounds of voices at night, sometimes counting, sometimes whispering confessions. Scholars debated whether these were residual hauntings, atmospheric hallucinations, or evidence of some unknown force rooted in the very material of the asylum. One account from 1983 recorded a hiker hearing distinct names called out in the dark, followed by what he described as soft, deliberate taps in the soil beneath his feet. He fled immediately, but later recalled the names as people he had never known, yet somehow felt he should recognize. In 1997, a documentary filmmaker attempted to capture audio from the hilltop. Microphones recorded faint whispers, but no crew member heard them live. When reviewed, the recordings contained speech fragments, counting and low murmurs repeating exact phrases from Margaret Clive's diaries, sometimes verbatim, sometimes in languages no scholar could identify. By 2010, the legend of Greystone Asylum had taken on mythic proportions. Academics, paranormal investigators, and local historians agreed on one chilling fact: the asylum's influence was persistent, regardless of the physical structure's existence. The voices remained, the counting continued, and any who approached the hilltop reported a subtle pressure, a sensation as if the earth itself were listening, taking note, and integrating new arrivals into its memory. And now, even today, those who tell the story recount it with care. They stress that no person who entered Greystone remains among the living. Their names, their confessions, their fears, all linger in a space between perception and memory, eternally catalogued by a structure that defies decay. Margaret Clive's words, Dr. Harlow's observations and the later accounts converge into a single truth. The asylum was never abandoned, and its voices never ceased. Some visitors swear they have felt it themselves, the subtle tug of acknowledgement beneath their boots, the faint brushing of whispered names along their ears. Scholars call it legend. Locals call it caution. And those who insist they have heard the counting agree. The asylum still remembers, still orders, and perhaps, in its meticulous patience, still counts the living among the dead. Greystone Asylum 1904 remains a place both real and imagined, documented yet elusive, and its echoes persist even a century later. And when the wind cuts through the hills, and the fog pools unnaturally around the skeletal trees, some claim they hear the patient, deliberate whispers of the forgotten, counting still, recording every voice, waiting patiently for the next to enter.